FORA.tv. The world is thinking.
The first libertarian zine of the 60s was called the Innovator, and it was very much into these kind of quasi-survivalism ideas. I'm going to read you a little bit about a couple of people who did that magazine. One, a man named Kari Thornley, who's sort of two great claims to fame, or he was one of the main inspirations behind the wonderful libertarian science fiction novel Illuminatus, the book that turned me into a libertarian. He also was an old buddy of Lee Harvey Oswald's from his Marine days, and actually wrote a sort of roman à clef novel in which a fictionalized Lee Harvey Oswald was the lead character before November 1963. So there's actually a novel about Oswald written before the Kennedy assassination. It's called The Idle Warriors by Kari Thornley. But at any rate, after that, Thornley moved out to California and was an editor on this libertarian zine called The Innovator, which I'm going to read you a little bit about now. Innovator's founder, Tom Marshall, was the patron saint of the libertarian notion that came to be called retreatism. The idea that the state was irredeemably corrupt and more or less impossible to fight. So the only option for liberty is to escape all the entrapping accoutrements of statist life, like homes and apartments, jobs, streets, post offices, taxmen and traffic cops, and retreat to the woods or even a cave. This whole cave idea became widely enough talked about in the movement that the would-be libertarian cave dweller had a widely understood nickname, the Trog, for troglodyte. Now, in the last years before this magazine disappeared at the end of the 60s, the Innovator was more or less inventing the fad of survivalism, with stories about, for milder escapees, van nomadism, which meant you could stay in civilization but just live in your car. And then for the more serious and dedicated, pure living off the land. The magazine would advise its readers on what plants you could safely eat in nature, unoccupied land where the federales were not apt to find you, how to bury your money in your food stores safely, and the like. The headline story in the last issue of The Innovator in '69 was, "America, loathe it and leave it." Now that seemed to say it all, and with that the zine folded. Now when it came to the survivalism aspect of the later Innovator, Kari Thornley, who in the 70s pretty much went what I think you would have to call insane. He became convinced that he had been a Manchurian candidate from birth, that his parents were involved in Nazi birthing experiments, and he was living in a drain pipe in Atlanta in the later years of his life. But anyway, when it came to the survivalism aspect, Thornley actually seemed like the normal guy on the team. So even though he was one of the founding fathers of retreatism, with his stories about how libertarians should retreat to the high seas on giant ships to escape the state, he later took to mocking Marshall's eccentricities. He joked that in Marshall's vision, the freest person was the one who locked himself up alone in a dungeon. Because after all, at that point, no one else could interfere with your choices or actions. Marshall's favorite kind of article, Thornley mocked, was one that, quote, instructed the reader how to enjoy freedom from the state here and now, by means of acquiring such an array of unique skills and equipment, or by employing such complex stratagems that it almost always wound up sounding to most people like more trouble than it was worth. Now, Marshall actually lived out his ideas. He completely disappeared from the sight of any of his friends in the early 70s. In his last years, he was living in the woods in Oregon. He would occasionally train people in his techniques of living off the land. Thornley had a story about Marshall's later days that he loved to tell. Marshall was living in a hole in the ground in Oregon where he had built this sturdy room of sorts. Now, some hippie friends of friends wrote to him at his P.O. box, wondering if they could meet up with him while they passed through the area. Now, Marshall carefully arranged a meeting in a public place and told them he'd love to take them back to his place, but would they mind if he blindfolded them? Okay, man. The hippies eventually found themselves in a modestly furnished, man-made underground cavern. A gracious host, Marshall then got out his stash of grass and commenced to roll a joint. Now, these two people were friends of friends. They weren't really aware of his whole retreatist philosophy. They only knew he was a friend of one of their friends. So they concluded that all of this subterfuge was strictly to avoid the prying eyes of police. One of the hippies said to Marshall, "Man, I got bad news for you. You're paranoid." Tom Marshall, beautiful man.